So I was supposed to go out with some friends today, and yada yada yada, I ended up here doing a Seinfeld review instead. Very fitting for the introduction for this episode, which I think is a classic. One of the best episodes, and one of the most popular Seinfeld concepts, of course. And one of the most popular catchphrases, too. Yada yada yada. Well, the episode is just the yada yada. I don't know why it's not the yada yada yada, but funny thing is, though, this episode was written by both Jill Franklin and Peter Millman. Peter Millman thought there was a different phrase that was in this episode that would catch on instead of the yada yada. But of course, the yada yada was the one that caught on instead. And like I said, it was very popular, used very well, just a simple little phrase just caught on big time. So, let's talk about the yada yada, which we did see the return of a couple of former guest stars. Deborah Messing, who played Beth Lookner, from back in the episode where George accidentally broke up Beth and David by a comment he made. Yeah, she's back, and she's getting married yet again. Mickey Abbott is back as well, and we also have the return of none other than Tim Whatley. I think when was the last time we saw Whatley? It's been a long time since we've seen Whatley, I feel like. But another great episode for sure. Let's get into it and talk about it. So, Jerry and George, first off, there was this scene at the beginning, I guess, where they were, their backs were to the camera. They were talking about being on a deserted island, but they were going to the bathroom. So it was just a weird opener, just random little thing. It really had nothing to do with the rest of the episode. But we start off in the coffee house. We meet George's new girlfriend, Marcy, who seems to be resorting to telling stories and saying, yada, 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 here I am, basically. Which George is wondering if yada, yada is bad. But Jerry claims that it's good. And George seemed to, of course, catch on to it and enjoy yada, yada, yada throughout the whole episode until a certain moment, which gets to that in a little bit. And while they're sitting there, in comes Tim Whatley, who mentions how he just converted to Judaism. He was Catholic, now he's Jewish. But then he makes a little bit of like a Jewish joke about some Jewish workout thing, which then seems to confuse Jerry a little bit. Now, this story about Tim Whatley converting and making Jewish jokes actually came from Peter Millman, who had a friend who, I guess, he converted to Judaism, and 20 years later, he finally made a Jewish joke. So he's like, wouldn't it be funny to see if, someone converted and then started making jokes like 2 days later? And, of course, it seemed to offend Jerry, of course, which it did. And Jerry starts obsessing over how Whatley's only been a Jew for barely any time, yet he's already making Jewish jokes, which seems to bug him. Elaine, of course, meanwhile, mentions to Jerry that she heard from Beth. And, of course, Jerry, who's had a thing for Beth, of course, after Beth went back to her husband David, apparently they did divorce in the end 6 months earlier. And now she's married again to a guy named Arnie. And they're looking to adopt a baby. And they picked Elaine to be a reference. So Elaine said she'll go and put in a good word for them. Meanwhile, Kramer comes in with Mickey. They're wearing the same exact plaid shirts. They're getting ready to go out on a date with two women they met. But of course, the thing is they can't decide who gets which woman. And that's been like a battle with them. Again, like what I love about Mickey's character. Again, little people, and then big Kramer, who Michael Richards is like the physical, comedian, having a great compliment with Danny Woodburn as Mickey. Again, I love his character. Mickey is definitely one of my favorite guest stars for sure. Every time he's on in an episode with Kramer, he's always beating Kramer up. And he could believably beat up Kramer too, which is even more incredible. They were arguing over which shirt they would wear. They would, basically wrestle each other in front of, the women because they can't decide which one they want to, focus on more than the other, basically, because they can't keep swapping dates back and forth for the rest of their lives, for crying out loud. So we have that feud going on. So anyways, which one should I get back to? Oh yeah, let's start off with Elaine. So Elaine then goes to the adoption agency, and she's telling some story about how they went to the movies, and Arnie snapped and said "shut up" to somebody, which of course obviously was not the right thing to say. I don't know why Elaine went there when she was trying to put a good word and said, that, and she realized her mistake, and they get rejected for adopting a baby. And of course, so they're going around now trying to, ask their friends what was said, and Elaine even yada yada over, the story about her, she had said about Arnie having the temper. Jerry, meanwhile, goes to see Whatley, and throughout this episode, there's times where George he's like appearing in the most random places, which was quite funny. Like he randomly appeared when in the dentist's office while Jerry was getting ready to see Whatley. And of course, Whatley comes in and starts making Jewish jokes again, which again bothers Jerry more. And then he even makes a Catholic joke, something about the Pope and Raquel Welch on a boat or something like that, whatever it was. And it starts to drive Jerry nuts. And so this is a hilarious scene. As a fellow Catholic myself, I even thought this was hilarious. Because I can tolerate them doing humor where it's like a non-Catholic goes into a Catholic church, doesn't know what they're doing, and yes, some people may find it insulting. I personally just found it funny how they played this off. Like the as Danny Woodburn said, the inside like the energy in Jerry's face of realizing he doesn't know what he's doing. So he goes to talk to Whatley's former priest, Dr. Curtis. And he didn't have any visiting hours available for a weekend, but he basically got directed to the confessional because Father Curtis was listening in on confessions. Well, Jerry walks into the confessional. There's no actual chair to sit in. Only thing that's in there is a kneeler. Jerry sits down, butt first, on the kneeler, and I just cracked up. He has his look on his face like it's totally normal what he's doing, but yet it's not. And of course, sometimes when you're in confession, some people, want to talk to the priest face to face. Some people don't. That's why there's the sliding door there, But instead, Jerry just knocks on the door, and Father Curtis opens it. And he goes, that is a kneeler, right? He goes, oh. And then, of course, he says, now, tell me your sins, son. And then Jerry mentions, well, I first should mention I am Jewish. And then he goes, oh, that's not a sin. And then he mentions how he wants to talk to him about Whatley and how he thinks he's converting to Judaism purely for the jokes. And then Father Curtis was like, and this offends you as a comedian? I mean, as a Jewish person? And he goes, no, it offends me as a comedian. And I think you should also know that he is out there also telling Catholic jokes. But they're all old jokes, and this, and the Pope and Raquel Welch. And he's like, oh, I never heard of that one before. And Jerry's like, oh, God. And he tells the joke, and Father Curtis actually surprisingly found it funny. And then he's like, well, if it bothers you that much, I can go ahead and talk to Whatley. Which, at first, I'm thinking, okay, isn't the priest not supposed to, reveal what he talks about in confession? But I guess since this wasn't really quite an actual confession, I think it's just more so just like a meeting. It's twice inside a confessional. But then Jerry makes some type of a dentist joke, and then the priest's like, that's funny. And then he just shuts the thing, obviously showing that he would kind of think that Jerry went a little too far with that dentist joke. And then, of course, George pops in and says, Jerry, I gotta talk to you about something. Oh, man. George was just popping up at the most random spots this episode. It was funny. George, meanwhile, is really enjoying this whole yada yada stuff with Marcy. Until, and of course, they yada yada over a lot of things. Like, George even yada yada over explaining, how he was engaged and now he's single. He goes, I was engaged, getting invitations, yada yada yada, I'm single again, basically. But then Marcy mentions that her ex-boyfriend was over late the previous night and yada yada yada, she's really tired today. Now all of a sudden George doesn't find the yada yada so funny anymore. So of course he goes over and mentions it to Jerry at his apartment, and he says, listen, Marcy came over Marcy mentioned her ex-boyfriend was over late last night and yada yada yada, I'm really tired today. And then what do you think she was tired from? Well, obviously the yada yada. You don't think she yada yada sex? And Elaine raised her hand and goes, I've yada yada sex. Really? Uh-huh. I met this Lori. We went out to dinner. I got the lobster bisque. Went back to my place. Yada yada yada. I never heard from him again. But you yada yada over the best part. No, I mentioned the bisque, which of course is a classic line for sure. But of course George trying to figure out what he's supposed to do. He goes to the bathroom, and of course Kramer came in and repeated the same exact line George just did. But yeah, him and Mickey just can't decide over, which date they want. So they had, Jerry and, of course, Mickey came in, they started wrestling with each other. Jerry and Elaine pitched the idea of why don't they show up early instead of crossing the table from each other and see who sits down with who. Well, they thought that was a great idea, but unfortunately they weren't there early enough because the ladies' names were Karen and Julie. They even couldn't tell which woman apart it was. And then they started wrestling over each other again. Kramer then finally decides he wants to call Karen after the second date. And he goes to meet Karen, but Karen's parents are over. But then he sees that Karen's parents are also little people like Mickey's, so he's like, oh, well, they have more in common. I'll just take Julie. So that's about to happen. That all seems to get settled for now, right? Well, then, Elaine. We'll get back to them in a second. But meanwhile, Elaine then says she wants to have lunch with Arnie to kind of make up for, what happened. But they still don't know yet that Elaine made that comment about Arnie's temper. And then Arnie was trying to ask Elaine about the yada yada. Because, of course, there was a scene before that where George was asking Marcy, what have you yada yada'd over? Of course, he finds out that Marcy actually is a queen shoplifter, and she's gotten away with getting, facials done without paying the bill. And then, of course, she asks, well, what about you? What did you yada yada over your marriage? Which we don't know if George told the truth now, because apparently they still were together because of how the episode ended, where George explained, where Marcy was. We'll talk about that, of course, when we get to the final scene. But Elaine, meanwhile, but that made, of course, that leads to Arnie, of course, wanting to know from Elaine what she yada yada'd over. And then, of course, I forgot what she said, but then Arnie said, just shut up, and snapped at her. And then Elaine said, see, this is why you're not having a baby, because this, and this. But then, of course, cooler heads prevailed, and even though Arnie still had his temper, Elaine said she's going to go back to the adoption agency and make this right. Which she does, and basically she tells the guy, the adoption agency, who is probably a lawyer also, she goes, well, let me tell you something. I'm going to make you do it, no matter what, basically. And it basically implies, I think she basically bribed them with sex, I guess, it looks like, because they were together in the final scene also. But then Beth showed up at Jerry's apartment, and she's like, you said you would always be there for me. She's thinking about leaving Arnie, because Beth thinks that, saw that Arnie met Elaine for lunch, and she thinks that Arnie's now cheating on Beth with Elaine. And then, of course, that leads also when Mickey walked in and announced that him and Karen were getting married. Because, again, Kramer mentioned to Jerry earlier how him and Karen have much more in common because her parents are little people, like Mickey. So they're getting married. Jerry's getting back together with Beth. George, though, is iffy about Marcy now because of her shoplifting and whatnot. And Elaine's now bribing the adoption agency lawyer or whatnot, to get the baby for Beth and Arnie. But then, of course, first off, before we get to Mickey's wedding at the end of the episode, which was a little goofed up, because it was supposed to be in a Catholic church, because Father Curtis also had Mass for the service. But the outside, I think, said that it was at St. Luke's Lutheran Church or something like that. Anyways, though, but then there was a scene where Jerry had to go back and get some more dental work done by Whatley. Whatley, though, was offended by what Jerry had said about him, what's it called? About him making that dentist joke when he was talking to Father Curtis in the confessional. So obviously, he was not happy with Jerry. Of course, later Jerry even mentioned how that the Kramer, and then Kramer calls Jerry an anti-dentite, which that's the word that Peter Millman thought was going to get over more, anti-dentite. But yada yada was more popular than anti-dentite. Anti-dentite was good, I'll give him that, but yada yada was definitely the phrase in this. So then in the final scene, like, everything came all blown together. Elaine was there with the adoption agency lawyer, who was not the best looking guy in the world. Well, what am I say? I don't check out men or anything. But anyways, Jerry shows up with Elaine. Not with Elaine. Jerry shows up with Beth. And then Elaine finds out that Beth and Arnie broke up. The strange thing, though, was Beth and Elaine didn't even talk to each other in this scene at all. But wouldn't Beth be upset with Elaine because Beth thought that Arnie was cheating on her with Elaine? It was weird how they didn't really talk. But of course, Elaine realizes she's wasting her time because now that they've broken up, Beth and Arnie don't need a baby now. George then shows up and he says, "Where's Marcy?" And she said, "Well, she went shopping and yada yada yada. I'll see her in 6 to 8 months." So he was still trying to be with her, but she shoplifted again and got arrested. And then Kramer shows up with Julie, but Kramer doesn't want to sit next to Jerry because of his dentist, because of him being an anti-dentite. And of course, the procession comes in. Mickey came in, and then Mickey's parents came in. And then Jerry tried to say hi to Mr. and Mrs. Abbott, but then Mr. Abbott introduces himself as Dr. Abbott and says how Tim Whatley was one of his students, and he heard about his little joke that he said. And if it wasn't his son's wedding, he'd be beating the crap out of him. And then, of course, Julie then breaks down because she revealed that she wanted Mickey, and she walks out. And then Jerry and Beth were making dentist jokes to each other and laughing, until Beth made a little bit like a racial joke about blacks and Jews, and that seemed to not satisfy Jerry. So of course that was the closing credits, and then in the credits scene, Jerry was walking back into the church, and Elaine said, "Where'd Beth go?" And Jerry goes, "She went to shave her head." So I guess obviously that didn't sit well, and then that they went Splitsville yet again. Too bad. Jerry's waited out 2 marriages, whatnot, and people were making marriage jokes to her. And of course, Mickey's been divorced a couple times as well. I don't know about maybe as many times as Ross Geller has been in Friends, but as of now, of course, I haven't finished. I'm on the end of season 9 now, but then of course, Father Curtis, who had just gotten wisdom teeth taken out by Whatley, and he had the swelled cheeks and couldn't really talk, so he basically skipped over everything and said yada yada yada, husband and wife, you may kiss your bride. As Mickey and Karen were walking out, Karen looks over to Kramer and said, "I wanted you." It all just blew up in their faces. Marcy gets arrested, so George loses her. Jerry loses Beth because she also made jokes against the Jews and whatnot. Elaine ends up taking out a very not so interesting guy to her, but she's only doing it to make up for costing Beth and Arnie a baby. And Kramer picked the wrong woman because Julie wanted Mickey and Karen wanted Kramer. Oh dear Lord, what a mess! What a mess, but an excellent episode. Like I said, definitely. I think it's one of the best episodes in this series. I think it's a classic. Some trivia though about this episode. Again, this was the first time that internet was mentioned in the series, when Jerry Cooks needed to be on the internet more because he was not aware that Beth and David had divorced, and now Beth was with Arnie. Peter Millman and Jill Franklin, again, who had written this episode, they were actually nominated for an Emmy for Outstanding Writing in a Comedy Series. And it was also Franklin's very first script. Robert Wagner and Jill St. John, who played Mickey's parents, were actually married in real life. Even though, of course, Deborah Messing, who plays Beth, made that racial joke, she actually, for real, in real life, is Jewish. And then also Jerry Marin, who played Karen's father, one of the little people, actually also played the Munchkin who hands Dorothy a welcoming lollipop in The Wizard of Oz. Wow, I didn't realize he was that old, of course, but that's interesting. And also there was I can't remember when, there was a moment in this episode where Elaine mentions Raquel Welch, which of course, funny enough, she would appear in the finale of this season. What would that be? We'll have to find out. But, yep, that's the Yada Yada. Again, a classic. Definitely, I think, one of the best episodes in the series, for sure. I would definitely rank this maybe in the top 5. Top 10 to be safe, but top 5. Definitely one of the best ones, in my opinion. So that does it for the Yada Yada. Next up is the Millennium, or the Numanium, as it's called. What happened there? We'll find out next. So once again, guys, what are your thoughts on the Yada Yada? Have you ever Yada Yada'd over anything important? Make sure to leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. And be sure, as always, to slap a like on the video. Subscribe for more content on my channel. Follow me on Twitter at DemandAirboy93. Don't be an anti-dentite, I guess I should say. And I will catch you all later. Have a great rest of your day. Peace out, everybody.